Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to have Alix here again, and for you guys to be joining us. Before I turn over to Alix, I do want to just take a note. One of the things with the speaker series that we try to do is promote organizations that support accessibility in sport or access to people. And so I really want to take a moment to emphasize kids sport and encourage everyone to go check out their local kids sport chapter. They've seen a massive influx in usership. And what kids sport does is provide basically scholarships so kids can have access to sport. And so they've seen massive increases like they've never seen before. So encourage everyone to go check out Kids Sport chapter and donate if possible. And Alix, and I will just tell everyone we are recording, so if you don't want to be seen, feel free to turn that off. And I will probably pin Alix, so then I think that'll make her there. All right, Alix, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to turn off my camera and mute and do all that.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Amy. I'm just going to ask everyone to bear with me while I get my screen sharing up and happening here. And I also just in advance of today want to say to folks that, I love seeing people on camera. I always love to see faces. And also, I totally respect that sometimes, you just need to be off screen because we are on screen so much these days. So I will leave that to you to manage your own screen time, but just do know I do love to see faces. All right, so yeah, good morning, everyone. So as Amy said, and as most of you know here, I'm Alix and I go by she, her pronouns. I'm super delighted to be sharing the virtual space with you all today. To begin, I want to take time just for a few notes of gratitude. So first to Amy and the Women in Sport Speaker Series for arranging this talk today. Next to all of you who are joining us today. And lastly, to my collaborators, who some of which are on this call, and I will mention more fully in a few moments. The work I'm presenting here today is a direct offshoot of my doctoral work, which I used to secure a grant from eAlliance Research Hub for Gender Plus Equity in Sport, which explores, as suggested in the title here, the intersection of sport, work, and gender, or what I call the sport, work, gender nexus. So something else I want to acknowledge before we get going here is that in this presentation, gender is discussed as a binary. So in other words, as female and or male categories. This is not a reflection of personal beliefs. Rather, it is a reflection of high performance sport culture, which continues to uphold gender as a binary and has a long way to go in terms of disrupting dominant gender views. I also want to take time here to acknowledge that today I'm tuning in from Tahamagouch, Nova Scotia, which is located on the traditional and ceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. The word Tahamagouch, which is Tahamagouch, translates to meeting of the waters. And the waters that meet here are the French and Wa rivers. I also want to remind folks tuning in of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, which also includes sport. So in highlighting these calls to action, I also seek to remind folks that sport can be a space of resistance and reconciliation, and that events like the North American Indigenous Games, which are linked to Call to Action 88, are important in this regard. And so in discussing Call to Action 88, I want to take some time to share some pictures from the North American Indigenous Games from last year, which also took place on Mi'kmaq territory and which I was thrilled to be a part of. The demonstration of Indigenous resilience and excellence, the opportunity to learn from and to be in community with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island is one that I will never forget and that I'm beyond grateful for. As a team sport athlete, I'm always grateful for the opportunity to work in teams. And so I want to take a moment here to acknowledge in advance of my presentation, my teammates on this project, specifically my and principal investigators, Doctors Persis Safai and Michelle Donnelly, as well as the graduate and undergraduate research assistants, Wajiha, Emerald, and Jesse. So with that acknowledged, my best hopes for today are to highlight the ways in which the sport work gender nexus requires women sport coaches to perform certain forms of visible and invisible labor. And more pointedly, this presentation will focus on how sport coaching has normalized overwork culture, which contributes to experiences of coach-worker precarity. I'm going to do this by briefly outlining the framing of the study, including the relevant literatures which inform the objectives of the study, the theoretical foundations, the methodology and methods, before dedicating a good chunk of our time today to the results and discussion, which will emphasize the important themes of time, emotional labor, and precarious work. To begin, I want to take a moment to reflect on my own positionality and specifically acknowledge that my experiences in sport as a former high-performance athlete and a current high-performance sport coach impact my research endeavors. More pointedly, I use the concept known as the sociological imagination in my work, which connects personal struggles to broader public struggles. This concept is what allows me to grapple with both the fascination and frustration of what I witness and experience in the world of high-performance sport. So to provide an example of how the sociological imagination informs my work, it was my experience of coaching at weekend tournaments and looking around the gym to find that I was often the only female head coach in the gym that sort of provided me with the opportunity to pause and critically reflect on where were the women's sport coaches, especially in a sport like women's volleyball, where the participation rates of women and girls in the sport are so high. What happened to these athletes that I was playing against? And why wasn't I seeing them in these leadership positions? So the opportunity to look at this helped me to realize that, this so-called personal struggle that I felt I was having of being the only woman in the gym was in fact attached to the much larger struggle within sport of getting women into sport coaching positions and having them stay in them. I also seek to acknowledge that how I interpret and move through the world is impacted by my white, cis, able-bodied female identity, and further that my social location both facilitates and constrains my participation in sporting spaces. In other words, my social location has certainly provided me many opportunities in sport, and in pursuing those opportunities, I've also confronted barriers. In contextualizing the research that I'm going to discuss today, it's important to highlight how women remain underrepresented and are marginalized at every level of sport in leadership positions, which include sport coaching. As the quote from the Canadian Women in Sport indicates, in Canada, whether it be at grassroots or the university and college level, women leaders are hard to find, which in the case of university sport is the result of an unfortunate downward trend that dates back to the mid-1990s. More pointedly, the data in Canadian university sport shows that where once women occupied roughly 54% of these head coaching positions, they currently represent just 16% of those same head coaching positions. And this situation is even more bleak at the Olympic or international level of sport, where just 8% of women in Canada occupy head coaching positions. Not only has the underrepresentation of women in sport coaching been identified as an issue, so too has the overabundance and presence of sport coaches who identify as white, as reported on in Joseph et al.'s 2021 study, which examined the Ontario University Athletic League. I'm drawing attention to these statistics in order to highlight how women with a range of intersecting identities are limited in sport coaching positions, and in particular, those whose gender identity intersects with additional categories of marginalization. Given this study's emphasis on political economy, it's important to acknowledge the current systems of capitalism and neoliberalism in Canada work alongside and intertwine with one another to create the conditions of work, which is increasingly being marked by a growing divide between quote unquote good jobs and bad jobs. When coupled with values like meritocracy or the belief that hard work equals success, working conditions are situated as a personal problem rather than a public problem. And this reproduces hierarchies of gender, race, class, and they also create the ideal conditions for precarious employment to thrive. With regards to precarious employment, it's important to acknowledge that the view of precarious employment used to inform this work resists dichotomies such as employed or unemployed, and rather seeks to acknowledge the variety of positions, standpoints, and/or circumstances of employees who occupy a range of social locations. This kind of expanded view of precarious employment is critical, as limiting the view to worker precarity to employed or unemployed overlooks a range of working experiences and undermines attempts to actually shift those circumstances. So this work attempts to acknowledge the range of experiences that may exist within a particular political economic context, that being Canada, and to contribute to a more nuanced views of worker precarity. In keeping with these more nuanced views, it's also important to acknowledge that worker precarity, as noted by the Canadian House of Commons report cited here, is exacerbated for certain groups, which includes women, visible minorities, seniors, youth, recent immigrants, and people without post-secondary education. Moreover, precarious workers were hit hardest by the global pandemic, both locally and nationally, and work that was previously viewed as low-waged or precarious, so for example, healthcare aides, grocery store clerks, became essential work. This in turn forced folks who were working in these essential jobs to risk their own health, while those in more stable forms of employment were afforded the privileges of working from home. And in case people here are wondering, like, why so much attention to precarious employment? That is because we are in a time where worker precarity and precarious working conditions are, to quote this article, widespread across the economy. To be honest, precarious work could be our entire talk for today, and I'm confident that many of us want to get to the sport portion. So for those who are interested in learning more, I encourage you to read this article, which is an interview between Kendra Strauss and a reporter. And Kendra is the Director of Labor Studies Program and Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Simon Fraser University. So in relating work, including precarious work, to sport, we can see that there is literature examining the effects of capitalism on professional sport, the commodification of sport. There's some work on worker rights movements within sport, as well as ill health effects of sport work on athletes who bear the brunt of sport labor. However, there's relatively little study of sport coaching through a sociological work and/or labor lens. So some of the studies that have more closely examined sport coaching work are outlined here, and it's important to mention that none of the ones of the studies listed here most focus on identity work, so professional agency as an example, and none of them draw attention to sport workers who are in the post-secondary environment, an environment that is increasingly being marked by precarity, nor do they speak to the lived impact experiences, rather, of coaches who may also be parents and may be engaged in unpaid domestic work, which could include the rearing of children. So to this end, I'm thrilled to share my most recent published work, which examines the precarity of sport coaching within the university sport landscape. This work adds to the aforementioned gaps in discussing sport coach work within university landscape, as well as the ways in which coaches who might also be parents, caregivers, and/or spouses experience coach work. And this is particularly important because the home life of sport coaches is often looked. overlooked rather. Additionally, of the work that does exist on it, most of it is focused on women's experiences of being a parent coach, which is connected to the fact that more often than not, women lead in the home. That said, only looking at parenting through women's experiences positions parent-coach problems as solely a woman's issue and reproduces heteronormative views of home life, which may overlook the experiences of same-sex assigned at birth couples. Connected to the discussion of gender and also of importance to this study is the fact that there's even less literature that examines the gendered and or gendering nature of sport coaching work, with a couple of studies examining coach-parent roles as conflicting roles, as previously mentioned, the invisible labor of women in sport, and the socially reproductive labor of women sport coaches. So the concerning trends that I showed earlier, coupled with these gaps in the literature, are what has informed this study's objectives, which are to examine how women's experiences of sport coaching contribute to notions of coach work as precarious work, and to highlight the implications of sport coaching precarity for women. In order to emphasize the results and discussion portion of this presentation, I will quickly outline that our study was theoretically informed by feminist political economy, which offers a lens that assists in accentuating all forms of labor, with particular attention paid to the lived experiences of women with multiple intersecting identities and the influence of state, market, and home life on these experiences. Our study was qualitative in nature, and we used solicited diaries and semi-structured interviews to collect the data. In total, we recruited 16 participant coaches who coached within the high-performance sport context, which in Canada includes both national and provincial sport, as well as the university and college sport contexts. Participants were required to document 2 separate weeks of coaching at 2 different times in their coaching seasons, as well as participate in 2 semi-structured interviews to assist with the analysis and interpretation of the solicited diaries. After data collection was complete, our team conducted several rounds of coding using thematic analysis, and from our analysis, identified the themes of time, emotional labor, precarity, and identity negotiation. On the screen here, you only see 3 themes highlighted, and that is because today's presentation is a reflection of a current draft of a manuscript that identifies these themes. We have another manuscript entirely dedicated to identity negotiation. This was the honors research of the undergraduate research assistant, Wajia Rasul. And so I am happy to answer questions. Also, Wajia is here. So I guess I don't want to offer this on her behalf, but she can also join us in answering some of those questions, so should people have them in the Q&A period. I also want to say that this work is ongoing and unfolding, and so I'm looking forward to hearing the feedback and the questions from the audience on this work as it continues to develop. So within the theme of time, we were able to locate several sub-themes that were connected to the areas you see outlined on the slide. By highlighting the theme of time, we seek to draw attention to the ways in which the interviewed sport coaches rationalize their internalized efforts to constantly be on the sport coaching job clock as just part of what comes with sport coaching. As it relates to nonstop coach work, Coach Hazel described coaching as a 24/7 gig, which for her meant that she never took her coaching hat off, as she was the contact point for 16 athletes. As a result of 24/7 work requirement of sport coaching, many of the coaches also discussed the ways in which they scheduled their days. For example, Wonder Woman showed us her daily planner, which was color coordinated. It was quite impressive, and went on to share about how she planned every minute of every day well, because she had to use every single minute, every single second well. She also went on to discuss how when her day had interruptions in it, these interruptions inevitably impacted her in negative ways, which in her case meant missing her children before bed, or missing parts of practices. So these experiences are touched on a little bit more in the theme of precarity. So while I'm sure it's not lost on any of us here how important time management can be in a demanding job, the nuances highlighted in this work, which are important to reflect on, are the constant, nonstop efforts of coaches to be working, which includes supporting athletes, having very little of life, let alone coaching unplanned, and the negative implications of things not going as planned. Linked to the need of planning was also this quote that looked at using vacation time to schedule or plan coaching activities. So the quote shared here by Lorna demonstrates her internalization of the idea that this is how Christmas vacation time should be spent. And so while perhaps some of us might be thinking, hey, if this is how she wants to use her vacation time, so be it. What I want to point out is that it's the trickle-down effect of this kind of thinking that is concerning. That being, if coaches are expected to use their vacation time to coach, when do they actually take time off? And if this is the expectation, then who, or perhaps more importantly, who cannot rise to meet this expectation? Connected to the theme of time management and planning was the struggle that most of the coaches discussed with documenting their time in the solicited diaries. Specifically, in nearly every interview, the sport coaches admitted to not actually completing the diary to the fullest extent, which was for a range of reasons. Ashley was honest about not documenting any of the time she thought about coaching, which for her felt nonstop. And she added to this by saying that she wasn't even sure how to quantify it. These quotes in particular highlighted one of the ways in which our participant coaches internalized the volume of hours they spent doing their work as just part of the job. This was obvious to us because when we asked why they didn't document certain things, they often replied with answers like, that's just what I have to do. So explanations like, it's just me, that's just what I have to do, it's just a part of coaching, so I do it all, create the conditions of overwork culture to exist, and again, set an expectation that may serve as a barrier to many seeking to stay in or get into sport coaching. Admittedly, as a sport coach myself, I was hesitant about the load that journaling would have on our participant coaches, as I knew it would add to their already full days. And I'm grateful for teammates and collaborators because there was no denying the value of documenting or not documenting, in the case of this research, the work a coach may be doing in their day. To this end, many of the participants offered their insights on what it was like to document their time. For Lauren, she came to realize how much time she spent doing administrative work, which led her to realize that she actually wasn't coaching as much as she thought she was. I want to take a moment here too to acknowledge that when there is a coach contract in place, and I say when, because some of our participants admitted to not ever signing and or receiving a contract. When there is a coach contract in place, the contract itself does not outline the granular details of what is required of sport coaches. Rather, these contracts cover the tasks of sport coaches with broad brushes. And so this is in part of what lends itself to coaches' internalization of working nonstop. When it comes to the theme of emotional labor, I decided to add in a slide here just to discuss what we mean when we say emotional labor, because it's been my experience that many are not super clear on what emotional labor means. So first, we use the work of Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist who studied flight attendants. And if you've not read her book, The Managed Heart, I highly recommend it. In this book, she outlines emotional labor as requiring one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward continence that produces the proper state of mind in others. So if I had to simplify this, this is essentially people-pleasing behavior. If I act this way, then I'm more likely to get a positive reaction, or at least one that does not cause the person I'm interacting with discomfort, even though it might cause me discomfort. So I'm not going to say or do things that might trigger a response that I don't necessarily want to hear because of a potential negative impact that it might have on other people. So this is thinking about the people we're interacting with. And I also want to include Svensson et al.'s study here, which expanded Hochschild's definition to include any management of emotion. So this is not just how I manage myself as a coach. This is also how I attend to an athlete, for example, who might be going through a difficult experience outside of sport. As it relates to suppressing emotion to assist in producing the proper state of mind in others, Coach Ashley said, I tried to remind the athletes to just have fun when really I was just frustrated. And probably I think it's actually rage underneath it all. Like I just did not want to be there. For more context, this was an assistant coach who was in a complicated and difficult situation with the head coach. She also followed up by sharing more about the situation she was in as one that regularly required her to manage her anger and how eventually this led her to removing herself from this particular coaching position, which was one of two of her coaching positions at that time. Moreover, Coach Ava discussed how, as the only female coach on her staff, she was required to do all of the athlete meetings, which were designed as an opportunity for athletes to provide feedback and ask questions. She discussed how her male colleagues who were also present during these meetings sat there, said nothing, and did not offer any support as she did her best to manage her emotions so that the athletes felt heard and or listened to. When we broaden the definition of managing all emotion, there was an incredible amount of data, which in the interest of time, I share this one insight from Serena. Here, and related to the theme of women's work in the broader political economy, there was a lot of overlap with social reproduction or the informal unpaid labor of, for the most part, women in households that sustains the capitalist mode of production. In this way, internalized constant coach work, which often includes the invisible labor of emotions and emotional management, is noteworthy and important to highlight in relation to the final theme for today's presentation of worker precarity. So to connect back to this study's orientation to precarious labor, I offer this definition provided by Leah Bosco from her book on precarious employment in Canada. Again, this definition acknowledges worker precarity as nuanced, and the study seeks to examine this nuance in relation to sport coaches. To begin, all of the participant sport coaches were hired for wage work by their specific institutions. There were a range of employment designations, so that included part-time, full-time, volunteer, head and or assistant coach positions, with no coach having a permanent work designation. And the sport coaches occupied a variety of social locations. As noted before, not all of the coaches from the study had received and or signed a contract, which is a noteworthy finding in and of itself as it relates to worker precarity. And for those that did, there was recognition from many of them that their contracts did not accurately reflect the amount of time required to spend on sport coaching. Other effects of sport coaching work were the lack of sleep that all participants spoke to. And I need to stress here all participants, because every single one of our participants mentioned not being able to sleep at night more often than not connected to the thinking of sport coaching. And I think this is a really important finding that, again, the fact that each sport coach spoke to is again just noteworthy. So I just want to pause there to really acknowledge the importance of that finding. Also, coaches discussed the requirement of needing to have other ongoing work in addition to sport coaching, just in the case their sport coaching positions didn't work out. For example, Connie said, "Coaching is my priority right now, but the other work, well, I'm just going to keep doing that to be ready. In case my coaching is gone the next day, then I have something to fall back on." So here, there's also an element of risk that is afforded to only some people. those people who can take risks, which is certainly not indicative of all female sport coaches. Lastly, as it relates to the theme of precarity, and in particular, how sport coaching precarity can be furthered for women identifying coaches, many, if not all of the sport coach participants who were also mothers spoke to experiencing guilt for a range of reasons, most of which were connected to the widely held societal belief that when women are not working, they should be spending time with their children. I want to pause here and make note that child rearing, which includes spending time with children, is connected to socially reproductive labor and thus is a form of work. So in this sense, not only do women have to manage their own emotions, they're also tasked with the double duty of both working within and outside the home. Finally, when women do take time off work, they're not taking time off of raising their children. They're taking time off from coaching positions that might help to advance their careers. Specifically, in discussion with Caroline, she mentioned how she had taken time off from coaching appointments to be with her family, and she often wonders if this had negatively impacted her. Here, I want to point out that in sport coaching, many coaches aspire to climb the coaching ladder, and that in order to do so, coaches are required to have experience in certain positions before being considered a qualified candidate. And so many feel that in order to be qualified, they must continue to say yes to positions and or opportunities at the expense, often at the expense of their own well-being. So to wrap up today, the data presented here is part of what has led us to conclude that sport coaching is a form of precarious labor, the conditions of which are made possible by coaches' continued internalization that being on the job 24/7 is just what comes with the sport coaching work territory. Additionally, the effects of this work have pronounced implications for women who occupy a range of social locations, and that if we continue to construct and or normalize sport coaching work as a 24/7 gig, then we can expect to see very little change with regards to women in the sport coaching landscape. Thank you, everyone, for your time and your attention today. I would absolutely love to hear from you if you have more questions past today. I understand that we're at various times in the day, and so you might need to jump off. My contact information is there. Please do reach out. I love hearing from people. And if anyone has questions right now, I am happy to answer them.
Alex, I'm sure you saw the Harrison Butker comments from the commencement speech the other night.
Yes, yes.
Totally interested in your lens using that sociological imagination, because I'm just full of rage. So I'm not really sure that I can put my researcher hat on and talk a little bit about that. But I'm curious as to your thoughts from a research-based perspective, particularly.
Yeah, sorry. Which commencement? I've actually seen a couple of commencement speeches over the last little bit that have been really interesting.
Yeah, so it's the one Harrison Butker is the kicker for Kansas City. And so he was speaking in the small Catholic college, and the comments around that was around the women here must be really excited about going on to get married and have babies, among other diabolical things that apparently he's really sure that women have been exposed to. So
right, okay, thank you for clarifying. Sorry, I hadn't
there
seen
have been
that
a few
one.
there have been a few that there's the governor in the South who said some pretty inflammatory things as well, and yeah, there we go.
Yes, and I'm thinking of another one that actually are like a solidarity group up at York who we've just come through another strike we're watching, and it was particularly interesting. So I mean, just like without necessarily having watched it myself, I mean, I think that just right there is sort of just a further reproduction of heteronormative views of you know, of the role of women in society and what women do and women's work more broadly. And I doubt that this individual would even have acknowledged that, you know, having children, the raising of the next, what eventually becomes the next generation of workers for the Canadian government and for, you know, our political economic workforce, for example, I would doubt that that individual would even take such a view, right? Because, you know, just being a mom and being at home and taking care of the home isn't work in the eyes of some folks. So yeah, I mean, it's just when I think about that through a sociological imagination lens. So when I think about a personal struggle being connected to a larger public struggle, you know, I unfortunately I see that as, in this case, this one individual is really reproducing something that I think actually a lot of people think, and I think it's important that moments like that happen in the sense of not the harm that that person is causing, but it helps us to realize just how far we've come. Because as a researcher in this field, the number of times and comments that I get like, oh, but things are so much better now and look how far we've come. And I'm just like, are you serious? So moments like this actually allow me to be like, okay, so let's case in point, let's take a look at this. Or, you know, for a long time there, it was the March Madness, the two picture. Oh, wait a minute. So we've talked about how far we've come, right? So, I mean, I think that's just really important for a number of reasons. So yeah, like irritating. And I'm going to look that up after this so I can like really get a hold on that, Beth. And then, you know, I'll probably
I
shoot
mean,
you
you don't
over a
have to.
message.
It's just gonna be rage filling. So I wouldn't advocate for it. There we are.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, Alex. That's awesome.
Thank you, Beth.
I'd love to ask a question too, if that's all right. So good to see you, Alex. And it's so cool to see all of these like pieces come together in this project. I'm so glad to see the emotional labor piece shine through as well. And the way that you've threaded them all together is just lovely. So couldn't be more happy with how this has all turned out. I'm super like my brain keeps on thinking like how like this overwork piece and this like, oh, we do it because we care and we're here because as women that's what's expected of us, but how are we tackling that with the like the competitive and high performance and hyper masculine side of the win at all costs, and how do we reconcile between those two? And I know that I'm not expecting you to have the answer. That's just where my brain lives. Here's your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you. It's good to see you. And there's so much in that comment, right? Like, and there's so much caught up in care and how individuals show care. And of course, I can't help but think of the work of, you know, a good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Emily McCullough, who looks at the ethics of care lens in sport and sport coaching. And so like what care is, you know, care is a relational construct. I always remind myself of that. So what care is to one person, you could think you're demonstrating care, but it depends on the recipient as well. It's not just the carer, it's also the cared for. And so like I'm giving all this time because I care. You know, the thing that I've heard more often is also, or connected to that is, well, I'm passionate about my work and I absolutely love the work I do. I'm reading a book right now called Can't Even, which I would highly recommend to anyone. First and foremost, Anne Helen Peterson's work is phenomenal, and it is Why Millennials Are the Burnt Out Generation. So that might land for some of you and it might not, but it talks about the way in which people's passion is taken advantage of. And the way in which our constant need to be like doing work is taken advantage of in the current day and context. So yeah, I hear that. And so then when I also think of, you know, the win at all costs and whatnot, I think the other thing that needs to be considered here is that it's a provocative statement to make, but it's one that I've made in this recent publication, is that it is the sport coaching credential that matters most, winning is what matters most. If you look across applications for sport coaching positions, you will not find uniformity in the qualifications, which include coach education and which also include coaching experience. What they want to see is, can you win? And I'll never forget too, connected to that, being in a room with Christine Dragic at the ABCA and listening to the president of, I think it was of the ABCA or the men, I think it was, Christine will correct me, but the men's, you know, lead coach or like program director saying like, yeah, like in the States, like we don't care. Like, can you win? Can you demonstrate on paper that you can win? AKA, have you allotted those wins? Do you have the winning record? Then we'll hire you. And that's particularly problematic because in order to amass the wins, you have to actually be in the space. And many women are having a hard time getting in the space. So how are they supposed to amass the wins, as an example? And more often that like only one team wins. Only one team ever wins, right? And like, even though you have a silver medal, a second place finish, which could be is a great finish, right? It's really the gold we're looking for. So I'm not answering your question. I'm being a classic academic over here and spinning it the way I want to. I think there's a lot tied up in both of those. And so like, if anybody else on here, by the way, if anyone here has a better response than the one I just gave to that, I just think there's a lot there to unpack, right? Please do chime in. Like, let's make this as like an open dialogue as possible, because the people that we got on this call like have so much experience. So
I was gonna say, I don't have an answer to you, Jesse, but I will say that dynamic between care and almost coaching. I'm going to call it coaching because so often I get criticized that I am not motherly enough. As a woman, right? As a woman coaching males, one of the primary things is like there's an expectation that I'm going to fill this motherly role. And when that expectation is not met, then I'm deemed as bad. So it's a really interesting dynamic to try and walk that of like, I'm actually coaching and I'm not here to be a mother. Am I caring? 100%. However, how does that show up? And it's funny because I just had a kid in the middle of a game tell another kid how he thought of me as a motherly figure because I've known him so long, which was a really kind of funny dynamic because I'm like, I just show up as a coach, but for him to openly say that was just such an interesting thing. And I wanted to comment, Alix, about the winning because instantly I go, when I think of winning, I think of, but what else is going on? And I'm thinking about, especially in the NCAA, of like, look at the winning programs and then look at the number of players they have in the transfer portal. And then what's happening there, right? What is the cost of winning? So,
well, and we need to broaden our definition of success in winning, because my goodness, when you look across the board, like it is a research, there is evidence that suggests that women who play sports more often than not end up in leadership roles, end up doing amazing things, contributing to society. Yeah, of course, we have some shit experiences and some of us have more, oh my gosh, I just swore, sorry. Some of us have more than others, but at the same time, it's like, are you kidding me to say that like what people are now doing because of the direct results in sport, how they're contributing to, like, we just need to broaden that definition, just crack that wide open. And so how do we do that? How do we get that into these institutions? How do we get that into policies and documents and coach year-end evaluations? Where is the column on success outside of on-court wins? Like, let's go. Again, another thing that I feel like in 21st, where we're at now, that we need to expand it, but we really haven't. And it's really hard because there are very few other professions where that kind of narrow margin of success exists. So that's another challenge that sport coaches and sport has. So, yeah.
I did have one thing. I made some notes. First of all, I don't have a contract, so I was laughing at that because I'm definitely one of those people in a position with no contract. And when I have signed contracts, often I think the intention of the contract was more non-compete than anything. I'm hearing there might be a hand raised, so let's I can't. If there,
Sorry, that's me, Christine. Sorry, I'm having technological difficulties, which is why my camera's not on. Apologies. Alix, thanks so much. That was amazing. I think it's really interesting in all of this that we want, you know, it's all about winning, but yet even when you look at job descriptions, maybe not a contract, but job descriptions, the word win doesn't really show up.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's fascinating to me. I mean, obviously there's an awareness that we shouldn't be doing winning, but we do winning because it's not in the job description. It's all this holistic, ballistic BS, you know, in terms of,
Yeah.
but really what they want is the win.
Yeah.
What do you think I mean, that's my assumption. What do you think the reasons are for that? And this conversation has been going on about redefining winning for decades.
Yes.
Why
Yes.
can't some places, and I'm going to say educational institutions as a starting point,
For sure.
actually find that different definition? Throwing that at you, Alix.
That's such a great question, Christine. And I just love it because, you know, I have the privilege of having conversations with Christine all the time, which is awesome and has just contributed to my understanding of sport and coaching and gender and all of what I do. So yeah, first off, yes, correct. I have analyzed, not for this study, but for, you know, my doctorate, I analyzed a lot of coach contracts and I asked a lot of coaches about coach contract work. We even asked coaches in this is one of my favorite questions and like a question that I'm like afraid to be asked myself, which is like, if you had to write your job description, what would it be? Right. And even in that question, like, you know, there were a few coaches who mentioned like winning, but that wasn't like necessarily top of mind. And again, you won't see that writing. Where you will see it in the coach documents is on the year-end evaluation, right? They want to see your demonstrated success. So to not have it in the job description, but then to have it on your year-end evaluation, you're telling coaches that it matters and it needs to be there and it's important. So it is really interesting why the post-secondary and thank you, Christine, for pointing out that this is something that, you know, predates my work and me, you know, like why we haven't gotten to that space is fascinating. Why wouldn't it show up? I think of, you know, the hiring and firing practices of coaches in the sense that, you know, and this is some of the feedback I got, and I'll be really open about it. Some of the feedback I got from the editors at the International Review for the Sociology of Sport was like, okay, but you know, you haven't demonstrated that coaches are actually fired based on their performance standards. And it's like, well, a couple of things. One, most coaches who are fired are like, I don't know how to recruit that population of people. I would love to, but that's pretty sensitive. And not everybody is ready to talk about those experiences. Two, sometimes those coaches don't even know why they've been fired because they've been read a human, the word is this, human resources report of like jargon from policy that says like, this is why you're being asked to step down, etc. And basically it's a lot of ways of skirting like the win-loss record. And I think that athletic directors too, like I'm so fascinated in that position. I want to understand that more, that they're spending so much of their time trying to lobby for sport to higher ups in the institution who are like, why do we even have it? Like, can we just not fund it? Because it's just taking up a bunch of support and resources. So ADs then feel the pressure that like, yeah, if our programs aren't winning, like we got to get rid of the coach must be the problem. Like it's always the coach is on the chopping block. It's not like there's never a deep dive into additional like, sorry, I shouldn't say never because I'm not an athletic director and I haven't done that role. So I'm going to walk that back there. But rare, like I haven't really heard experiences of that. So, you know, I think the reason why it doesn't show up is to potentially avoid some issues that come up potentially in the firing of a coach, and why they haven't included it is again, more so to the extent of, yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I would love to see that change. And I would hope, and I think that some people on this call, you know, will be a part of making that change. So it's a good question, Christine. Thank you.
I believe Jenny had her hand up.
And also, Christine, like if you want to jump in and give your answer to that question, because I'm sure you've got some ideas, like I would love to hear it. I'm sure people on this call would love to hear it too.
I don't have an answer in it. And I think actually what Beth just said in the chat is that
Yeah.
they don't know how to define it, and they just don't know. And I don't know. And you got to be creative. And I think it takes a lot of thought and hard work and long term, even, you know, long term looking at it. So
yeah, and again, like to your point though, and to the comment that Beth made in the chat, like it's like you'd think that in the post-secondary environment, like the educational environment, that we might be able to redefine that and come up with another way of thinking about that. That yeah. And so like this is the thing, is like individually as a coach, you can be doing that. And that's awesome. And that's great. And I know a lot of people on here are doing that with their teams and are saying like, hey, like this is a success. Let's see this as a success. It's how you get it institutionalized and recognized in the institution. And the other thing that's coming to my mind right now, just through some of the social justice theories that I've looked at, is like institutions love uniformity. They love it, right? And if they can keep it uniform and they can keep it the same, right, then anyone who exists outside of that, well, again, it's a you issue, not an institutional issue. And so there's so much power wrapped up in that as well.
Alex, I was just going to add to that to
Yeah.
you know, in your comment in terms of saying, you know, that people on the call can make the change, right? Realistically, the person that we would have to influence in order to make that change is, you know, a high performance director or an athletic director, right? In order to make those changes. And I think it is possible to do that. The problem is they change so often that it becomes a challenge to continue to have those conversations and to perpetuate that change in behavior.
For sure.
But I do think it is possible.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the glasses half full view, but always an optimist.
Hey, that's me too. Like that really is my true heart. And I also do want to say, thank you for saying that, Beth, an opportunity to clarify. I am not putting the responsibility on the shoulders of all of these people. Rather, it is to say, you know, if we can stick together and rather, I just want to share that, like, I'm not like the answer to things, and I'm not like the knowledge keeper in this sense. Like we're all like, I know most people on this call, like everybody here is a knowledge keeper. And so, you know, it was more my attempt to like open it up and like hear what other people on this call have to say, because we're navigating it. We're trying to, but it's true. And then, so then I think like, you know, because people have said to me, like, don't you want to be an athletic director? Or like friends have sent me athletic director positions and been like, you should apply for this. And I'm just like, part of me is like, can I do it? Like, I'll be honest, part of me is like, you know, can I do it? And I can hear then Christine saying, yes, of course you can do it, and all the different things. And B, like, is that the space that I would want to be in? Like, I just so love working with people and being with the people, and at that level, like what happens to that, right? And would I be able to still be Alix in that role? I don't know if I would be able to be, or maybe not right now, but maybe that is something to consider in the future. But ultimately, it's going to take being in that position and that kind of power and influence, right? And I constantly begrudge and bemoan about needing progressive leadership. And then, you know, I myself am not currently pursuing that. So yeah, how do we get the ear of those folks?
I have my hand up, but I'll just start talking. I think that's an awesome point, Alix, and I think you would also be an incredible athletic director. You'd be awesome at whatever you're going to do. So let's just stop there. But I think that I'm also interested in the precarious labor of athletic administrative staff. I think that their work is also completely like very undervalued. And while they do try to provide support for the coaches, they are stretched within a system that values these wins and losses. So they're answering to someone, and it just like perpetuates the precarity. So I think that would just be one day, it'll just be another study that happens, but
oh, totally. And I have some really good friends, like some of my best friends are in admin in athletic departments, and listening to their stories and also their views of sport coaches. Like they're like, sport coaches are the worst. The emails that I get from them are harrowing. And like, and then I'm sitting there going from the coach perspective. I'm like, oh yeah, there's so much more contextual factor. So I think that also brings up the fact that like we have a relatively fractured system of sport. And like even within, so this is something more connected to my doctoral work, even within the institution, we're so siloed. We're so just putting our head down, nose to the grindstone, because I got to make it through and I got to get it through. When it probably would be really beneficial if we could sit together and say, hey, listen, I don't do hockey and I don't do rugby, you know, or I don't do lacrosse or field hockey. I don't do those sports. And yet we're both coaches. Like, what can we possibly, you know, how can we support each other? Or what can we share with each other here? So yeah, I just think, yeah, there's a real need for that. And there's a real need to examine all levels, right? But that is like 6 doctoral dissertations wrapped into one. Maybe that's something that you're gonna do. Like, I don't know, but that would be really cool and really interesting. So thanks for those comments.
Okay. Oh, Jenny. Oh, let's see. Jenny's coming back. Let's see. Jenny, are you able to unmute now? No. Okay, still tech issues there. Jenny, if you want to type the question in the chat box, then we can work our way through it. I just want to thank you all. Oh, I want to thank you all for this great discussion and so many problems that we can solve in the future. Yeah, I have a page of notes, and my brain just thinking about all the things that I'm looking at through my work right now and just how it all ties together. So just want to see if Jenny is gonna leave us a question. If not, we'll wrap it up.
Well, and I will say too, like I'm surprised, like most of the question I get, especially based on how I end, which I realize the end is a little more glass half empty, which isn't, I'm much more of an optimist like Beth as well. You know, a lot of people have been asking me like, so what? So now what? So what do we do? And I will say that I'm working on some work right now that is looking at a restructuring of sport coaching and how we could possibly do it in a way that is more where there's more well-being for all folks involved. So I don't want to say too much because I'm still very much in the thinking, the theoretical phase, and I'd be nervous that what comes out doesn't make any sense. And so I'm just giving it a little bit of time to like percolate and to come up with something more solid. But I have a lot of ideas, and you know, I'm really hoping that that is kind of the work that I continue to do in this space. So stay tuned. Like there's always more. And like, again, if people on here have ideas or want to talk more, like I would just so welcome the opportunity, because this is such a kick-ass group of people. So yeah.